I invite you to join me in attitude of prayer. Gracious God, I ask that you would allow us to be open and receptive to the ways in which your spirit dwells in this place. That you would move us, that we might, Lord, be motivated and inspired to go out into the world and do the work you have called us to do, the work that our souls must have. I ask these things in your Son, Jesus Christ. Let everyone say. Amen. I have always felt that there was a curtain, or as Du Bois would describe it, a veil between myself, my community, and the world. I never noticed it when I was a child or a young adult, and I wasn't necessarily looking for it as much. And it wasn't until I was older, after I graduated high school and was trying to find a job and eventually going to undergrad and graduate school, that this veil became much more apparent, more visible, yet somehow even more untouchable. But once I could see it, once I could begin to describe the division between the world and me that was caused by the veil, I began to see it everywhere. And I wondered why other people could see it. I wondered if I was paranoid, or if I was imagining things, or if I was, as they were saying, just wanting to make everything about things, the intersectionalities that so many of us have, make them about the things that the veil separates us from. Once I noticed the pervasive reality of the veil, I couldn't unsee it, even though there were times when I would have liked to, even though there were times when I thought that's what I would best do to preserve my own sanity. And so the question that I have for you all this afternoon is, what do we do? How are we to live when we live with the awareness of these divisions? How are we to live when we can see the veil that divides us from the world? Moreover, how do we, people of faith, make sense of the fact that other people of faith claim that there is no division between the world and me, and they use religion to justify their blindness or to justify the veil through their warped theology of sin, telling us that it is our sin that is the cause of our suffering? How do we live in a world such as this? It is not easy, and I don't want to pretend that it is. And I think this is why I have always loved Jeremiah. I know that most prophets are reluctant. Some of you in this room are probably reluctant to pursue ordination or reluctant to even be in this space, but God has placed you here. Rarely is someone excited to take upon the role of a prophet in their own community. But Jeremiah is very clear about this reluctance, and at times he feels that God is forcing him to do this work. In chapter 20, verses 7-9, he writes, "Lord, you enticed me and I was taken in. You were too strong for me and you prevailed. Now I'm laughed at all the time. Everyone mocks me. Every time I open my mouth, I cry out and say, violence and destruction. The Lord's word has brought me nothing but insult and injury, constant." That's what I thought. I thought to myself, I'll forget him. I'll no longer speak his name. But there's an intense fire in my heart, trapped in my bones. I'm drained trying to contain it. I'm unable to do it. And so I find myself with a fire in my bones that will not allow me to unsee what I now so clearly see. You see, Jeremiah didn't want to see everything that God had given him the vision to see. He didn't always want to speak the words that God had given him to speak. He too was caught between two worlds, the world as it is and the world as it could be, or the world as he thought it ought to be. His sermon in chapter 7 to the Israelite community was given between the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the Babylonian Empire. This was a politically turbulent time in Judah's history, a time when the nation grasped for any sense of security. And it was during this time that some people within the community began to believe that the temple itself was some sort of guarantee of God's presence and protection, as if God were bound to the temple despite their disobedience and their corruption. As it says in verses 3-4, this is what the Lord of heavenly forces, the God of Israel, says: improve your conduct and your actions, and I will dwell with you in this place. Don't trust in lies. This is the Lord's temple, the Lord's temple, the Lord's temple. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, my mother said something 3 times. I knew she wasn't going to say it a 4th. I knew. And so that meant I need to pay attention to whatever words were coming out of her mouth. God urges them to don't trust in the lies. And verse 8 goes on to say, yet you trust in lies that will only hurt you. In Howard Thurman's amazing work, Jesus and the Disinherited, in this chapter on deception, Thurman writes that, quote, it is a simple fact of psychology that if a person calls a lie the truth, they tamper dangerously with their value judgments. Further, he writes that the penalty of deception is to become a deception, with all sense of moral discrimination impaired. Someone who lies habitually becomes a liar. It is increasingly impossible for them to know when they are lying and when they are not. End quote. God says, do not trust in lies, and yet you trust in lies that will only hurt you. The lie that the ancient Israelite community had come to believe was that their covenant with God was made secure through their rhetoric and performance of rituals in the temple, and that the transformation of their hearts, the spiritual formation that should prompt them to be holy because their God is holy, wasn't necessary because they believed themselves to be safe as long as they had this temple. So in his sermon, Jeremiah is confronting a community in crisis because their rituals, their practice of religion had shifted to focus on performance, but not transformation. They worshiped a place and were sure to worship God in that place because they believed God would protect that place. And therefore, God would protect them from the Babylonian Empire in that place. They had fallen victim to the lie that their religion, their covenant with God, was rooted in ritual performance and didn't require the sort of personal transformation that would inconvenience them or force them to change their behavior or to see things that they did not want to see. God says, do not trust in lies. And yet, if you trust in lies, they will only hurt you. To be sure, we find ourselves in an eerily situation similar to the context of Jeremiah. Some denominations, some churches, and some so-called Christians have come to trust in a multitude of lies that uphold the veil that exists between the world and me. They trust in these lies so deeply that I believe that they have become the lies that they tell themselves. They believe the lies of patriarchy, that men are God's chosen leaders, yet they make excuses when these men fail at some of the most basic tasks of their vocation, like being a president and actually understanding the Constitution of the United States. They believe the lies of patriarchy, even though research shows that the countries led by women had systematically and significantly better COVID-19 outcomes and suffered half as many deaths on average than those countries led by men. God says, do not trust in lies. And yet if you trust in lies, they will only hurt you. They believe the lies that white America is under attack, that they are experiencing reverse racism, and that the system is rigged against them. They fail to understand the distinction between believing themselves to be white and the logic of whiteness. the racial caste that places whiteness as a central marker of humanness. They fail to understand that for the vast majority of white people, the idea of whiteness will only provide a psychological rather than material benefit. As MLK Jr. says in his speech, Our God is Marching On, if it may be said of the slavery era that white men took the world and gave black folks Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow. A psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, and that was better than being a black man. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities of his low wages that they could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores and on the streets and in public buildings. And his children too learned to feed upon Jim Crow. God says, do not trust in lies. And when you trust in lies, they will only hurt you. Far too many Christians and Christian churches believe the lie that the religion of Jesus, that Jesus' spiritual path of radical compassion doesn't require personal transformation that moves us towards a love ethic. They believe the lie of cheap grace, and their Christianity is transaction. If they believe in God, they can avoid going to hell. This is the substance of their theology. And in this way, they have replaced the aspirational nature of the religion of Jesus with a kind of religious consumerism. In a consumer society, we create ourselves through things, and we change ourselves through changing our things. Radical transformation for these people consists of going on a diet and exercising, moving across the country, or changing careers, or changing the objects around us without changing the subjective self. The purpose of religion for them becomes to make them feel good about themselves and be happy. It is God's job in their mind to solve their problems. After all, their God is their personal savior. Personal savior, or rather, one might say a personal trainer that's focused on their well-being. Given this, it is no wonder that far too many Christians are unable to see the veil that exists between the world and me, and perhaps the veil that exists between the world and you. And so the question I return to is, what do we do? How do we live in a world such as this? In Ta-Nehisi Coates' book that clearly influenced this sermon, he writes that we are called to struggle, not because it assures us of victory, but because it assures us an honorable and sane life. There is truth in his argument, and I do believe that the lives of those of us who see the veil, who call attention to the lives of those of us who seek to hold those in positions of power accountable for their actions, for us, struggle will be a constant companion in our lives, a thorn in our sides, as Paul might say. We will not avoid struggle. However, the religion of Jesus shows us that the struggle to move society to see us as full human beings, the struggle to pull society towards love and justice is not about our individual sanity or honor. Rather, it is because we see beyond the veil. We see how we are all interconnected. And so we see how our suffering is interconnected. I see how my suffering is tied to your suffering, and you see how your suffering is tied to mine. We refuse to believe the lies that created the veil. We see God in one another. This is how we survive. We begin to see God in one another. This is how we live. We see God in one another. So when we feed the hungry, because we see God in that person. We give water to the thirsty because we see God in that person. We welcome the stranger because we see God in that person. We care for the poor and the sick because we see God in that person. We seek to dismantle the systems that normalize this dehumanization because we see God in that person. We see the suffering of the world as God's suffering, and we are called to do something about it. This is how we flourish in a society that is premised on upholding the veil. So you see, love is the only way we can live in a world that seeks to believe the lies that it tells about itself. Love allows us to see the lies for what they are. They are lies. They are not true. And when you believe that lie, it will cost you your life. Love for God, love for each other, and love for ourselves. This is what binds us together so that we can do the work required to dismantle the veil that exists between the world and me. Thank you.